Hi, and welcome to the next video of our course History of English 2 from Synthetic to Analytic. Today we're going to wrap up our block on early modern English, and we're going to do the following. First, we're going to do a short recap of the Great Vowel Shift, and then we're going to have a look at the second very important aspect of the development of English that took place during the early modern English period, and that is the standardization of English. We're going to have a look at the different aspects of the standardization process, and we're also going to have a look at what we know as standard language ideology. And at the very end, we're going to have a look at what Quakers have to do with early modern pronouns. Okay, so let's have a look. So, Great Vowel Shift, right? So, this is something that you probably remember from last week. During this period of early modern English, beginning in the 15th century until the beginning of the 18th century approximately, there was a huge development of the pronunciation of English. This change affected first long vowels, and these long vowels either shifted to a higher position in the phonological system of English, or if there was no higher position to be moved to, they shift to a diphthong. Right. And this process took several centuries to finish, and you can here see the different stages of this Great Vowel Shift. And last week, we also had a look at John Hart's proposal for a reformed spelling, which showed us how this pronunciation actually looked like in the second half of the 16th century. Right, but now we're going to have a look at how the different aspects of language actually developed and how they were standardized towards the form of English that we know nowadays as the present-day English, as the standard English. Right, so we already know something about standardizing spelling. So there were people during the early modern English period who tried to propose a new way of spelling English. One of them was John Hart. We talked about him last week, so I'm simply going to mention him for the sake of argument here. So there were people who tried to invent a more perfect way of spelling English, right? Because they were unhappy about the situation that you pronounced words in English in a wildly different manner than the way you actually wrote them down. Right, but then not only spelling was standardized, also grammar. There were people who wanted to standardize the grammar, right? So there were different varieties of English being spoken, but there were people, just for example, Robert Louth here, who wanted to write down a set of rules that would tell you how you are supposed to use the proper English, standard English variety. And some of the rules that Robert Louth actually developed during the 18th century are still something that we know nowadays, right? So let's have a look at this. Two examples of his rules. This, you see that you are not supposed to end a sentence with a sentence, right? The so-called preposition stranding. This is something that Robert Louth was opposed to, that if you want to have a nice standard English, you should not do that, right? So, and he gives here the example, you should not say something like, whom I am much delighted with, but rather something like, with whom I am much delighted. Okay. Another thing that, for example, we can find in Robert Louth's text is the rule that says that you are not supposed to use two negative expressions in one sentence, right? Because those negatives would cancel each other out, and you are not supposed to say something like, I don't have no money, but you are supposed to say, I don't have any money, right? So no two negatives in one sentence in English. Okay, another thing that we need to standardize if we want to standardize a language would be its vocabulary, the lexicon of a language. And one of the first vocabulary actually of English was compiled by Dr. Samuel Johnson, who in 1755 has published in 1755 the Dictionary of the English Language. Right, so you probably know this person, but I'm not sure whether you really knew that he was Samuel Johnson and that he was responsible for compiling the first English language dictionary, right? And this is also something that you actually find in the memes that are being used on the internet. For example, here, Samuel Johnson is telling you something about a word a lot, that you're not supposed to write together as a lot, but a lot is actually two words, and you are supposed to spell that accordingly. Okay. And then if you want to standardize a language, and you already do things in the different sort of aspects of language, like spelling and grammar and pronunciation and vocabulary, you also sometimes want to have an institution that would actually oversee this standardization process. And this is actually something that happened in different countries. For example, the first one was in Italy, the so-called Accademia della Crusca at the end of the 16th century, and then also in different German states. For example, the fruit-bearing society in Weimar. That didn't last so long. But then, of course, the very famous one is the Académie Française from the year 1635. In England or in Great Britain, there was never such an institution as Académie Française in France, but nevertheless, they managed to standardize the language even without the existence of such an institution. But that doesn't mean that there were not proposals to found such an institution or to have something like an English academy. Right, but in some countries, these institutions were established and they actually oversaw or introduced different regulations to standardize their respective languages. Okay, and now let's have a look at something that is known as the standard language ideology. Right, so in order to be able to talk about standard language ideology, we have to talk a bit now about what it actually means for a variety to be the standard variety. Right, so a standard variety is seen by the speakers as a prestigious variety, right? So prestige of the speakers is then transferred to the language they speak. So if you have mostly what you do, if you standardize a language, you take the most prestigious variety and you declare that to be the standard. But there are no linguistic reasons why a variety should be the standard one or another one should not be the standard one. It's basically for reasons of prestige or non-linguistic reasons why you take one variety over the other. Another thing that a standard variety is supposed to be is it is supposed to be invariable, right? So standard language or the standard variety of a language is supposed to be static, solid, and not changing. Another thing is that a standard variety should be, or is very often seen as a formal way of speaking, whereas non-standard varieties that are some in a hierarchy lower than the standard language are seen as informal and very often also sloppy. Right. And then if you standardize something, in our case, standardize the language, you actually impose uniformity upon a class of heterogeneous objects, right? So you have different varieties, different dialects of English, for example, and we saw how these different varieties actually look like several weeks ago when we talked about Middle English dialects. And what you do by standardization, you actually put one variety that on top of all these different varieties, and you declare that variety to be the standard one that is supposed to be accessible to all, and that is prestigious. And ideology is a set of implicit or explicit ideas or axioms, biases. Sometimes you don't really know that you have one, but very often people are aware of these ideologies about language, and they also explicitly write them down when talking about language. And this is something that we're going to have a look at in a second, right? Another thing is that standard language, seen from the perspective of the so-called standard language ideology, is seen as correct, and it is according to the common sense that the standard variety is seen as the correct one. There is no justification needed, and very often, or actually always, no justification linguistically is actually possible, right? So, for example, if you have a look at the English pair of expressions, it is more correct because it is the standard, right? But depends definitely on the context. But now I'm giving it just like that. It is I sounds more correct than it is me, right? And that is because standard forms, regardless of the form, are seen to be more correct than non-standard ones. And that also leads to the fact that you, for example, are more inclined to write standard in a written context. You would more often write standard forms rather than in the spoken context. And it doesn't really matter how many times the incorrect form is actually used in the real world, but it is seen as incorrect nevertheless, right? So even though you say it is me all the time, and you almost never say it is I, you will nevertheless regard it is I as the more correct, because it belongs to the standard language. Okay, right. And then another thing that we have here, this is a letter written to the Manchester Guardian Weekly in the late 1990s, right? And what this concerned viewer or reader says here is that there is not much of a future for any language if it is left exclusively in the hands of the careless and the ignorant, right? And this is just an example of another aspect of the so-called standard language ideology that tells you that there is this idea that standard language, and in particular standard language, is something that has to be molded and that has to be somehow steered by a group of intelligent, wise people who know how the language should function, and that you should not leave it to common people, because otherwise the language will deteriorate and ultimately disappear. Right. Now, just to give you an example how this is actually still being used nowadays, I'm just giving you here a couple of quotes from a Facebook discussion where a couple of people are talking about how English is now worse than it was a couple of centuries ago, right? So here there is one person who says that this is why English mote bring back GE forefixed makes for clearer grammar than man sees now, right? And another one, and someone else says, okay, languages don't usually need to make things clearer for learners. They are already clear enough for the native speakers. Okay, and then another one, I think not. English is a mess, and I say that as a native speaker. Right, so you have to bring something back to have a clearer grammar, right? English is a mess. So nowadays, English is worse than it was earlier on. And another important thing is here that we put up with what is a shoddy and lackluster tongue, making for a lackluster and shoddy mindset in many areas. So this is also important. What you very often see in this standard language ideology is a connection between bad language and bad mind or bad people. So that if you use your language incorrectly, you are also it tells something about your mindset or about your cognitive capabilities and things like that. Right, and here, for example, right, the same person says that, okay, English is especially sloppy due to not being English for the best deal of 800 years and accepted needless words infusion from elsewhere that rots the morphology of the given tongue. Right, so this is something that you probably know from other languages as well, that if a language uses loan words, that language is somehow degrading itself, and loan words are bad and should be omitted, right? And here, basically, this person actually says that English was proper English 800 years ago. What he probably means is before 1066, when so many French loan words entered the language, right? Okay, so what we've seen in such a discussion is that, for example, foreign language can rot the morphology. Another important or interesting thing is to have a look at the way this person argues. So it's not. This is a metaphor, right, of the language rotting and the loan words and the foreign influence are the rotten apples that make all the good English apples rot as well, right? Another thing, right? English is nowadays a mess. It was better, clearer earlier on, but now the speakers have ruined it. Right, and also another thing, this connection between speaking a messy language leads to a messy mind, right? So if you speak correctly, you also think correctly. And another thing that is very often reiterated in these discussions is that we as a speech community should return to an older and a better version of the language, right? So this idea that somewhere in the past the language was perfect or almost perfect, and then in the course of the past centuries or decennia, depends on the situation, the language deteriorated, and we should do something to stop that. And right. So before we go to the Quakers, this is something that we're going to have a look at in our online session, but more on that later on. Let's now have a look at something that we addressed actually 2 weeks ago when we talked about the change of the pronominal use in Middle English when people started to use the plural pronoun when addressing a single person. Right. This was basically this, that in Middle English, and before that you had thou and thee for the single, for a single person, for the singular number, and then you had ye and you for the plural number. During the early modern English period and after that, what you got was basically was basically you for the plural and for the singular. So you have this distinction in Middle English between thou and ye. One is for singular, one for the plural, and you use that to express politeness in singular contexts, right? So if you address a single person with a pronoun for plural, for more than one person, you express your respect to that interlocutor. Whereas in present-day English and also in early modern English, you basically only use you, and there is no distinction between the polite and impolite plural. There are other ways to express politeness, but not by means of pronouns. Okay, but the thing is that, and I've shortly addressed that before, the form that we are actually using nowadays in present-day English is the old dative and accusative, the so-called object form of the pronoun, right? So you have, so it's not ye, the nominative, but it's the dative case. And this is actually something very weird, right? Why should you use this form? Why not ye? That would be the default form, so to speak. And there are basically two possible reasons for that. One might be sort of the formal analogy with thou, right? So you have so you have the old singular form with ou, so that you replace it with another form that also has ou, right? So thou, you, thu, you. And the other thing, how you would be able to explain that is, for example, that this pronoun, the vowel in the pronoun is very often reduced in pronunciation. So if you have something like, have you done it yet? And now try to listen to that once again. Have you done it yet? Have you done it yet? You don't really hear whether it is have you done it yet or have you done it yet. You really have to stress the pronoun in order to pronounce the oo sound, right? So have you done it yet, as opposed to have you done it yet. So the distinction between ye and you might have actually been obscured by this reduction of pronunciation. Furthermore, there are also other similar expressions in English that are that may be used as analogs for this development, right? So you have this expression, it is me, or it is us, it was them, and you also use the dative or the object form of the pronoun and not the nominative, right? So it is I, it is we, it was they. This is sometimes used, but very often you would get the non-nominative form instead of the nominative. Okay, so now we know something about the early modern English period, about the pronominal use in that time. The thing that you might ask now is that, okay, so we know that in Middle English it was really sort of very straightforward. If you're speaking to a superior, you would use the plural noun. The plural pronoun. If you're speaking to someone who is close to you or to an inferior for socially inferior, you would use the singular form. But the thing is, nowadays we only use the one form, right? The plural one. So the question would be, how did you actually stop being polite? So why do we now use you all the time, but we don't use it as a polite pronoun, right? And this can actually, we can see this happening during the early modern English period. And one way to see how this is, or what people thought about that at that time, is to have a look at grammar books, right? And if we have a look at one such book from that period, we'll see something like that when talking about the singular and plural pronouns. So here, let me quote, "It is customary among us, as likewise among the French and others, that we speak but to one particular person, to use the plural number, but then we say you and not ye. And if anyone speaks to another in the singular number, as thou Thomas, it is reckoned a sign of contempt and familiarity." Or familiarity. And then this grammar is written as a question and an answer, right? So the question is, what words are of the second person? Right? Thou is of the second person singular, and ye or you for the second person plural. And then another question, but we use you when we speak only to one person. How can that be then of the plural number? The answer then, custom has made us do so. The verb that is put to it is always of the plural number, for we say you love, which is plural, and not you lovest, which is the singular, and it is counted ungenteel and rude to say thou dost so and so, right? So here we see actually a stage of the development of the pronominal system where the author of this grammar book recognizes that there are that you can use thee or thou when talking to a single person, but it is considered actually rude or ungenteel, right? So something that you should not do if you don't want to sound as a rude person. And if this is the incentive, then you automatically sort of you automatically start to use the polite form. But if you use the polite form, you, very often, and in all different situations, the politeness of that form actually ceases to be that explicit over time. But at that time, during the early modern English period, for example, the 17th century, this is something that was still very much a thing, right? So you were supposed to use you when talking to a single person if you wanted to show respect. And this is where the Quakers come into play, right? So for those of you who who are not familiar with who the Quakers are, they are a religious society, right? A Protestant Christian denomination founded by this man called George Fox in the 17th century. Officially, they are known as the Religious Society of Friends, but also Quakers. And they were opposed to a number of things, such as wars, military service, slavery, alcohol, swearing oaths. But they were also opposed to the use of the so-called singular you, right? So they were opposed to using you when talking to only a single person. For religious reasons and for reasons of all persons being equal, so there is no need to show respect, right? We're all brothers and sisters, and that's why you don't really need the polite form or respectful pronoun. This is also sometimes called plain, so Quaker plain speaking, plain language. By the way, Quakers actually were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1947 after the Second World War. Okay, so now let's have a look at what the Quakers actually think about using you when talking to a single person, right? The Spirit of God also, which leads to one and to divide and distinguish singular from plural, many things from one thing, and one from two and three, and many men and women from one, and the many words from one, and the many gods from one, and the true Christ from the many antichrists and false. Right? So it's actually something given, something divine to distinguish one from many or from two, and we should do that also in speaking. Right? So even in speaking, there is no reason to use plural for when talking to a single person. Right. Right. And then George Fox also argues that if you send your children to schools, right, they learn how to speak Hebrew and Greek and Latin and also English grammars. And all they hear is that all these languages have a singular pronoun and a plural pronoun, and that the plural pronoun is used when there are more than one person, and the singular pronoun when they are talking to a single person. But then they go out, right? And if they talk to somebody during the early modern English period in England, and this interlocutor is actually a social superior, you are supposed to use the plural form, even though if it's only a single person. And if you don't do that, right here at the very end, if your child practice that which he has learned at school to distinguish singular from plural, which you have paid for, he's called a clown and unmannerly and ill-bred. Right. And George Fox and the Quakers alike were actually a group that, as I said, were opposed to this. And people really, really didn't like that, right? So, and we know that because George Fox actually wrote a diary, and we have access to this diary where he described what happens when he uses the wrong pronoun in everyday life, right? So here we have an encounter between George Fox and a woman, right? And George Fox writes in his diary, "And afterwards I passed away through the country, and at night came to an inn, and there was a rude company of people, and I asked the woman if she had any meat to bring me some. And she was something strange, because I said thee and thou to her," right? So this was in an inn, and he asked whether he could have something to eat, but used the wrong pronoun, and the bartender was angry. And another diary entry is here when George Fox did not want to take off his hat to show respect, and he was brought before a judge, right? So George Fox and a justice. And before I was brought in before him, the guard said it was well if the justice was not drunk before we came to him, for he used to be drunk very early, right? A drunk judge on top of all of that. Right? And when I was brought before him, because I did not put off my head and said thou to him, he asked the man, the guard, whether I was not mazed or fond, right? So whether I was not mad or imbecile. So people really cared about the right pronoun in the 17th century England. Okay, but let's have a look, and this will be the last point for today, at what we are going to do next. We're going to do on the thing that we're going to do on the 23rd of June is going to be an analysis of the art of English poesy by George Puttenham, and we are going to have a look at how the standard language ideology actually worked in the 17th century. or during the early modern English period. Right, so you have a look at the handout that you'll find on Blackboard and try to find answers to these 5 questions. Thank you for watching and see you next week. Bye.